The night shift is often seen as just a mundane part of life, quiet streets, empty roads, and the occasional late-night delivery. But what if, during those seemingly routine hours, you were being watched? Imagine you're a fast food delivery driver working late into the night. The routine is simple: pick up the food, deliver it, and repeat. But suddenly, a shadow falls across your path, an eerie figure that appears during every delivery, always at a distance. At first, you might think it's just a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But as the nights go by, the figure draws closer, becoming more menacing with each encounter. You start receiving texts from your own phone, chilling messages that warn you not to look back, telling you that the figure is much closer than you realize. The line between reality and nightmare blurs as the man begins to invade your every waking moment. What happens when the terror follows you home, when your safe space is no longer safe? When the shadowy figure appears inside a gated property, performing a sinister ritual with hollow eyes and blood-red crosses? Brace yourself as we dive into the terrifying story of a delivery driver haunted by a relentless stalker. This is no ordinary late-night shift. This is a descent into a waking nightmare where every shadow hides a new threat. Get ready to experience fear like never before. The Watcher is not just a story, it's a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurks in the corners of our world. Are you ready to face your worst fears? If you found yourself on the edge of your seat, craving more spine-chilling stories and heart-pounding scares, you're in the right place. Don't let the fear end here. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. By subscribing, you'll never miss a moment of terror. Be the first to experience the darkest tales, the most unnerving encounters, and the creepiest mysteries that will haunt your nights. Plus, your support helps us bring even more chilling content straight to your screen. So, if you're ready for more thrilling narratives and real-life horrors, make sure to click subscribe and turn on notifications. Trust us, you won't want to miss what's coming next. I've been delivering fast food for about 6 months now. It's not the most glamorous job in the world, but it's easy enough, and it lets me save up money to finally move out of my parents' place. They've never really been supportive of my choices, and living under their roof has always felt suffocating. This job, picking up orders, dropping them off, repeating until my shift ends, it's simple, mindless work. Perfect for someone trying to keep their head down and get out. Most of the time, people don't even bother opening the door. They just want their food left on the porch. I get a little notification on my phone, maybe a quick "thank you" text, and then I'm on to the next delivery. Easy money, no real interaction, no hassle. But about a month ago, something started to change. At first, it was barely noticeable. I'd pull up to a house for a delivery, and across the street, there'd be this guy. He was just standing there, not doing anything. It seemed harmless enough, maybe someone out for a late-night walk. I didn't think much of it. But then I started seeing him more often. Always standing across the street, just watching. Different houses, different neighborhoods, but there he was. Every single night. Same guy. Same dark clothes. Same stillness. I tried to shake it off. I mean, when you work the night shift, you see all sorts of weird things, people acting strange, wandering around in the middle of the night. You learn pretty quickly to mind your own business. I convinced myself it was nothing. But after a few days, it started getting under my skin. I'd pull up to a house, glance across the street, and there he'd be, just standing there, his eyes following me. It wasn't like he was approaching me. He wasn't trying to talk to me. He wasn't even doing anything that I could call the cops about. But something about him, his stillness, his focus, it made my skin crawl. The way he just stood there, like he had nothing better to do but watch me. I began expecting him. Every time I pulled up to a delivery, I'd scan the area, looking for him. It became like a game, except it wasn't fun. It was nerve-wracking. I started parking in places where I could make a quick getaway, just in case. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't help it. One night, I had a delivery in a quiet neighborhood. You know the kind, dark, with only a few streetlights, and the houses spaced far apart. It was around midnight, and I pulled up to this house on the corner of Maple and 7th. I parked, grabbed the bag of food, and started walking up to the front door. My footsteps felt loud in the silence, echoing against the pavement. That's when I saw him again. Standing across the street, just like always. But this time, something felt different. He wasn't just a distant figure in the dark. He was standing closer. Close enough that I could see the faint outline of his face under the streetlight. I tried to ignore him. I really did. I dropped the food off at the door, took a quick photo for the delivery confirmation, and hurried back to my car. But when I glanced over my shoulder, just for a second, I could have sworn he had moved. Not much, just a little. But he was definitely closer. My heart started racing. I threw the car into gear and drove off, trying not to look back. When I got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way he just stood there, watching, waiting. And that feeling of him getting closer, it gnawed at me. The next few nights were the same. Every time I pulled up to a delivery, there he was. Some nights, he was farther away, barely visible in the shadows. Other nights, he'd be standing under a streetlight, clear as day, just watching. I began avoiding certain neighborhoods, hoping that I could shake him off, but no matter where I went, he was always there. I kept telling myself that it was just some weirdo, nothing to worry about. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Something that didn't make sense. And then came the night that changed everything. The night everything changed started like any other. It was a Friday, and the orders were coming in fast. I was making good money, but my nerves were shot. By this point, the guy had become a regular part of my night shift, always there, standing across the street, never saying a word, just watching. I had stopped telling myself it was a coincidence. He was following me, I knew that much. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out why. That night, I had a delivery out in the suburbs, one of those quiet neighborhoods where all the houses look the same, with neatly trimmed lawns and fancy porch lights. The kind of place where the streets are empty after dark, and the only sound is the hum of crickets. I parked the car, grabbed the bag of chicken sandwiches, and glanced around. I didn't see him, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe tonight would be different. I walked up to the house, the only light coming from a dim porch light that flickered weakly, casting long shadows on the driveway. I dropped the bag by the door, snapped the usual confirmation photo, and as I turned around to head back to the car, I saw him. This time, he wasn't across the street. He wasn't even on the sidewalk. He was standing at the end of the driveway, closer than he had ever been. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could see him clearly now, his pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp. His skin was as white as paper, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were hollow, like black pits. But the worst part, the part that made my stomach churn with dread, was the red crosses painted on his face. Thick, blood-red lines cutting across his forehead, cheeks, and down to his chin, like some kind of twisted religious marking. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, his lips barely moving, like he was whispering something to himself that I couldn't hear. My mind raced with questions. Who was he? What did he want? Why was he following me? I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. It was like I was stuck in some kind of nightmare, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't wake up. I could feel his gaze burning into me, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. I didn't run, I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing how scared I was, but I walked quickly, keeping my eyes on him the whole time. As I got to my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I dropped them twice before finally managing to unlock the door. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it immediately. I sat there for a second, breathing heavily, trying to calm down. I glanced up, expecting to see him still standing there at the end of the driveway, but he was gone. Just like that, he had vanished into the night. I started the car and sped off, my heart still racing. I didn't care about speed limits or stop signs, I just needed to get away. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the next chance to get closer. That night, when I finally got home, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it was just some freak, some guy trying to mess with me. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. This wasn't just some random weirdo, there was something darker, something almost otherworldly about him. And no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was after something. Maybe me. I barely slept that night. Every creak, every gust of wind outside my window made me jump. I kept my phone by my bed, checking it obsessively, half expecting a message or a call from an unknown number. But nothing came. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe it was over, that maybe he had gotten bored and moved on to someone else. But the next day, it got worse. I had switched to day shifts after that night. The thought of seeing him again during another late-night delivery was too much for me. The day shifts paid less, but I didn't care, I just wanted to feel safe again. For a few days, it worked. The sunlight felt like a shield, a barrier between me and the nightmare I had been living. But the peace didn't last long. A few days after that last encounter, I got my first text. I was sitting in my car during a break, scrolling through social media, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Don't turn around. I stared at the screen, my blood turning cold. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to assume it was some stupid prank. But then another message came through. I tried to carry on as if everything was normal, but it wasn't. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat. Each message was the same, don't turn around. And every time, I resisted the urge to look over my shoulder, even though my skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. I started jumping at every little noise, checking the windows and doors obsessively, making sure they were locked. But no matter how many times I reassured myself, that feeling never went away. I stopped sleeping. Not really, anyway. I would drift off for an hour or two, only to jerk awake in a cold sweat, convinced that he was standing over my bed, watching me sleep. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around me like a vice, squeezing tighter with every passing day. My boyfriend tried to comfort me, but even he couldn't understand the depth of my terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. It all came to a head one night, during what I thought would be my last delivery. I had been thinking about quitting altogether. The money wasn't worth the constant anxiety, and even though I had switched to day shifts, I still felt like he was watching me, lurking somewhere just out of sight. But I needed the cash, and I convinced myself that one more delivery wouldn't hurt. It was a late order, but nothing unusual. A delivery to one of those upscale neighborhoods on the outskirts of town, the kind where every house has a security gate and a perfectly manicured lawn. I pulled up to the address, parked by the curb, and grabbed the bag of food from the passenger seat. As I stepped out of the car, I noticed the street was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I felt it then, that familiar prickle at the back of my neck, the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around, scanning the shadows for any sign of him, but the street was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I hurried up to the gate, pressed the intercom, and waited for the usual click of the lock opening. Nothing. I pressed the button again. Still nothing. I sighed and checked my phone to make sure I had the right address. That's when I saw it. A new text. "He's closer than you think." My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I lifted my head and looked through the wrought iron gate into the property beyond. And there he was. He stood in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the porch light, half hidden behind a tall oak tree. But I could see him clearly, his pale face, marked with those same blood-red crosses, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. My hands shook as I tried to call the customer. I didn't care about the delivery anymore, I just wanted to get the hell out of there. But before I could dial the number, another message popped up on my screen. "Don't run." I froze. How the hell did he know what I was doing? My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out every other sound. I didn't want to look up again, but I couldn't help it. When I did, he was closer. He had stepped out from behind the tree and was standing in the middle of the driveway, his head tilted slightly to one side, his lips moving silently. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see the frantic way his mouth moved, like he was muttering some kind of twisted prayer. Panic surged through me. My mind screamed at me to run, to get back in the car and drive away as fast as I could. But my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place, paralyzed by his gaze. And then I saw it, his hands. They were raised above his head, fingers spread wide, palms facing the sky. At first, I thought it was just part of the weird ritual he seemed to be performing, but then I noticed something else. Something horrifying. His palms were bleeding. Thick, dark blood dripped from his outstretched hands, pooling on the driveway beneath him. I watched, frozen in terror, as he brought his hands down slowly, smearing the blood across his face in thick, deliberate strokes. He was painting more crosses, adding to the ones already carved into his skin. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, like the world had shrunk down to just me and him. My lungs burned as I struggled to breathe, and my vision blurred with tears. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some stalker. This was something worse, something I couldn't explain, something beyond my control. Finally, my body reacted. I turned and sprinted back to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock the door. My hands were slick with sweat, shaking so badly that I dropped the keys twice before I finally managed to get inside. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and tore out of the driveway without looking back. As I sped down the empty streets, my phone buzzed again. Another message. But I didn't check it. I couldn't. I knew what it would say. I didn't need to read it to understand that he wasn't done with me. This was just the beginning. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the front door of my parents' house. I should have felt safe, this was supposed to be my sanctuary. But all I felt was dread. The feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I climbed out of the car, locked it behind me, and hurried inside, bolting the door and checking every lock in the house. I didn't tell my parents what had happened. They wouldn't understand, they never did. I just wanted to forget, to pretend that maybe this nightmare would end if I ignored it long enough. But when I lay down in bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way his eyes had seemed to bore into me, his bloodied hands raised in some twisted offering. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the image from my mind. Then, just as I was about to drift off, my phone buzzed again. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't. But I couldn't help myself. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and unlocked it. There was one new message. Let me in. This third part amplifies the terror, detailing the disturbing ritualistic behavior of the stalker and the terrifying closeness of his presence. The protagonist's fear becomes palpable as the haunting presence takes on an almost supernatural quality. The tension escalates as the driver finds himself completely at the mercy of a force he doesn't understand, leading to the chilling final text, "Let me in." The text message, "Let me in," was like a death sentence. I could barely keep my eyes open, my exhaustion compounded by the unrelenting terror that had become my new reality. I'd hoped that by switching to day shifts, I'd put some distance between myself and the nightmare. But the messages hadn't stopped, and the fear had only grown. It wasn't just about a man watching me anymore, it was something far more sinister. The next day, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible. I was supposed to meet my boyfriend for lunch, but my mind was too clouded with fear to enjoy anything. The message had left a gnawing pit in my stomach, an anxious energy that refused to dissipate. I couldn't tell him the full truth. He'd already been worried about me, and I didn't want to scare him further. Instead, I forced a smile and pretended everything was fine. We talked about trivial matters, plans for the future, our favorite movies, and the mundane details of daily life. I tried to focus on his comforting presence, but the message echoed in my mind, like a broken record. After our lunch, I headed home, feeling a sense of dread weighing heavily on me. As soon as I walked through the door, I went straight to my room and locked it behind me. I needed to be alone, to think clearly. The house felt stifling, each creak of the floorboards and distant sound of the house settling only heightened my paranoia. I tried to remind myself that my parents were home and the house was safe. But the comfort of security was now a fragile illusion. I decided to do some research on the internet, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was happening. I scoured forums and news sites, looking for similar stories, trying to find some logical explanation for my situation. I found nothing. Just ordinary stalkers and urban legends, none of which matched the bizarre and unsettling experience I was living through. It was then that I stumbled upon an old news article from a decade ago, buried deep in a local archive. The headline read, "Local girl missing, family desperately searches for answers." The article detailed the disappearance of a young woman named Alice. Her family had reported her missing, but despite an extensive search, she was never found. The case had gone cold, with no leads or suspects. I clicked through the article, my heart pounding. The details were chillingly familiar. The girl had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and her family had been left with nothing but unanswered questions. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Alice. The name from the stalker's ramblings. I hadn't made the connection before, but now it was clear. Whatever was happening was linked to her disappearance. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man watching me had some connection to Alice's case, but how? And why was he targeting me? As night fell, the anxiety returned with a vengeance. I was on edge, unable to focus on anything other than the creeping dread that filled my every thought. I tried to sleep, but every rustle of the leaves outside or creak of the house made me jump. I finally gave up and sat at my desk, staring at the old news article on my laptop screen. I decided to dig deeper, hoping to find something that might give me answers. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed again. I glanced at it, my heart racing. Another message from my own number. "She's closer than you think." I jumped out of my chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The message seemed to pierce through the fog of fear that had settled over me. I knew I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed to get out, to clear my head and try to make sense of everything. I grabbed my jacket and car keys and left the house, locking the door behind me. I drove aimlessly, the streets eerily quiet under the moonlight. The message felt like a taunt, a cruel game designed to torment me. My mind raced, trying to connect the dots between the stalker, the old news article, and the messages I had been receiving. I needed answers, and I was willing to go to any lengths to find them. I ended up at a small, dimly lit park on the edge of town. It was a place I had visited a few times before, a quiet spot where I could think without interruption. As I parked the car, I noticed something strange, a figure standing by the park's old stone fountain, partially obscured by the shadows. My blood ran cold. It was him. I had hoped that I was just imagining things, but there he was, his pale face illuminated by the flickering streetlight. The blood-red crosses on his face seemed even more pronounced in the dim light. He was standing still, facing the fountain, and I could see his hands moving, as if he was tracing patterns in the air. I wanted to drive away, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. The man turned slowly, his hollow eyes meeting mine. He took a step toward the car, and I could see his lips moving, but no sound reached me. The terror was overwhelming, almost suffocating. I took a deep breath and forced myself to get out of the car. I had to confront this, to understand what was happening. I walked toward him, my legs shaking with each step. As I approached, I could make out the words he was mouthing, "Find her." He gestured toward the fountain, and as I looked closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a small, worn photograph lying at the base of the fountain. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and my heart sank. It was a picture of Alice, the same girl from the news article, looking directly into the camera with a hauntingly vacant expression. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Alice wasn't just a missing person. She was somehow connected to this man, to the ritualistic behavior I had witnessed, and to the terror that had invaded my life. He was trying to show me something, but what? Before I could process the enormity of what I had found, my phone buzzed again. Another message. "She's waiting for you." I felt a surge of panic. I needed to get back to the house, to confront whatever awaited me there. I sprinted back to the car, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. As I drove home, the fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind turned into a full-blown frenzy. What was waiting for me at home? Was Alice somehow involved in this nightmarish game? And what did the stalker want from me? The drive felt interminable, every shadow and every noise amplifying my terror. When I finally pulled up to my parents' house, I took a deep breath and braced myself for whatever lay ahead. As I stepped inside, the silence was deafening. The house felt colder than usual, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the fear that had been building inside me. I knew that whatever was happening, it was far from over. The message was clear, Alice was waiting for me, and I had to face whatever that meant. I locked the door behind me and slowly made my way through the house, my eyes scanning every corner for any sign of the stalker. The anxiety was unbearable, each creak of the house or rustle of the curtains making me jump. I had to find answers, to understand why this was happening, and to put an end to the nightmare that had taken over my life. But as I reached my room and looked around, the horrifying truth began to sink in, the nightmare was far from over. The messages continued, and the stalker was still out there, waiting. And the worst part? I had no idea what he wanted, or how to stop him. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood in the dimly lit hallway of my parents' house. The silence was oppressive, the kind of quiet that presses against your eardrums and makes every little sound feel amplified. The message from my phone echoed in my mind, "She's waiting for you." I had no idea what awaited me, but I was determined to find out. I crept through the house, each step feeling like it was echoing through the empty rooms. I checked every door and window, making sure they were locked and secure. The house, normally a place of comfort, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and lurking danger. Every time I heard a creak or a sudden noise, my heart leapt into my throat. I reached my room and hesitated before opening the door. I took a deep breath and turned the handle, pushing the door open slowly. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tightly. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers shaking. When the light finally flickered on, I scanned the room, expecting to see the worst. But there was nothing out of place. My bed was neatly made, my desk was as I'd left it, and the room seemed eerily normal. I let out a shaky breath and turned to check under the bed and in the closet, but again, found nothing. The feeling of unease grew stronger. The messages, the stalker, and the photograph of Alice had set me on edge, and now the anticipation was almost worse than the actual fear. I sat down on the edge of my bed, my phone clutched in my hand. I stared at the screen, willing it to stay quiet, but I knew better. The messages had been relentless. I had received another one just as I was leaving the park, "She's closer than you think." The words haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something I wasn't prepared for. As I tried to calm myself, my phone buzzed again. I stared at it, my heart racing. Another message. "I'm already inside." Panic surged through me. I bolted out of my room, my mind racing. I had to check the rest of the house, but every second felt like an eternity. I moved from room to room, calling out, hoping that whoever, or whatever, was in the house would show themselves so I could confront it. As I reached the living room, I noticed something odd. The front door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it before leaving. My stomach dropped. I edged closer, peering around the corner. The room was empty, but a strange smell lingered in the air, a mix of something foul and metallic. I approached the door cautiously and looked outside. The street was dark, eerily quiet, with only the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight breaking the monotony. There was no sign of the stalker. I stepped outside, my breath misting in the cool night air, and scanned the area. The sense of being watched was almost palpable. Then, I heard it, a soft rustling from the backyard. I turned quickly, heart racing, and made my way to the back door. I paused, listening carefully. The rustling was more distinct now, a rhythmic shuffling that seemed to come from somewhere near the old shed at the end of the yard. I opened the back door slowly and stepped out. The yard was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps. I moved cautiously toward the shed, my footsteps muffled by the grass. The rustling grew louder as I approached, and I could hear muffled whispers, unintelligible but clearly distressed. I reached the shed and hesitated before opening the door. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. Inside, the dim light revealed a scene that made my blood run cold. There, in the far corner of the shed, was a large, crudely drawn symbol painted in blood-red paint. The symbol looked like a grotesque amalgamation of shapes, but it was unmistakably related to the blood-red crosses I had seen on the stalker's face. And then, I saw her. Alice was there, or at least what was left of her. Her image was distorted, her features almost inhuman. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at me, and her body was covered in the same strange symbols that marked the walls of the shed. It was as if she had been sacrificed in some twisted ritual. I stumbled back, feeling my stomach churn. The realization hit me with a jolt. The stalker wasn't just watching me. He was using me to complete some kind of ritual, one that involved Alice's torment and death. The messages, the stalking, it was all part of a larger, horrifying scheme. I needed to get out of there. I ran back to the house, my heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. I felt the walls closing in, the weight of the horror pressing down on me. I had to get help, but I couldn't call the police, not yet. They wouldn't believe me, and I wasn't sure how to explain what I had seen. I was left alone in the house, the silence now more oppressive than ever. The messages had stopped, but the fear remained. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare, to make sure that Alice's death hadn't been in vain. The stalker had made it clear that he wasn't finished, and as long as he was out there, I wouldn't be safe. I knew I had to act quickly. The longer I stayed, the more dangerous it became. I had to gather what I needed and leave, but as I packed a few essentials, the sense of dread grew stronger. The stalker was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew that whatever came next, I had to face it head-on if I wanted to survive.